The ink had faded over the years, softening from a stark, angry black into a muted bluish gray. It was a large, intricate piece that covered the majority of her left forearm, a sprawling canvas of imagery that most people found unsettling. To the casual observer in the bustling coffee shop or the crowded grocery store line, it was just another bad decision from a misspent youth. They saw a grotesque fusion of twisted metal, a weeping angel with a shattered halo, and the jagged, broken letters of a word they could never quite decipher. They saw the kind of tattoo that screamed rebellion, poor judgment, or a desperate need for attention. They didn't see Clara, they just saw the ink. Clara had grown accustomed to the stares, the whispered judgments, the way people's eyes would slide to her arm and then quickly away, their perception of her shifting in an instant. She was a high school history teacher, a woman who spoke in measured, thoughtful tones about the Peloponnesian War and the intricacies of the Magna Carta. She wore cardigans and sensible shoes, and her hair was always pulled back in a neat, unassuming bun. The tattoo was a jarring, violent counterpoint to her otherwise placid existence. It was a secret she carried on her skin, a story she never told. The worst were the open, unguarded comments, like today. She was standing in line at a popular local diner, a place famous for its mile-high pies, waiting for a slice of key lime to go. Behind her, a group of young men, fresh from a gym and brimming with post-workout confidence, were talking loudly. One of them, noticing her arm, nudged his friend and snickered. "Whoa, check out the ink on that lady," he said, not even bothering to lower his voice. "Bet that looked real smart when she was 20. Wonder what it's supposed to be, a train wreck?" His friends laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Probably got it in prison," another one chimed in. "Or for an ex-boyfriend. Big mistake." They laughed again, the sound sharp and dismissive. Clara's jaw tightened. She didn't turn around. She had learned through painful experience that engaging only made it worse. It gave them the reaction they wanted. She kept her eyes fixed on the dessert case, her face a mask of serene indifference, even as a familiar dull ache settled in her chest. The laughter felt like small, sharp stones being thrown at her. She paid for her pie, the paper bag crinkling in her hand, and turned to leave, keeping her head high and her eyes forward. As she passed their table, she could feel their smug gazes on her back. They were still chuckling. They had no idea. Clara was just pushing the heavy glass door open, the cool afternoon air a welcome relief, when a man was about to enter. He held the door for her, a simple, automatic gesture of politeness. He was in his late 40s, perhaps, with a salt and pepper crew cut and a physique that spoke of rigorous, lifelong discipline. He wore a plain gray t-shirt and jeans, but his posture was ramrod straight, his eyes clear and observant. He glanced at her with the polite, fleeting acknowledgement of a stranger, and then his gaze dropped, as it so often did, to her forearm. But his eyes didn't slide away in judgment or discomfort. They locked onto the image with a jolt of recognition that was almost physical. He stopped mid-step, his hand still on the door. He stared at the twisted metal, the weeping angel, the shattered letters. He wasn't seeing a mistake, he was seeing a memory. His face, which had been a neutral mask, suddenly underwent a profound transformation. The color seemed to drain from his cheeks, leaving them a pasty white beneath his tan. His eyes, a startling, piercing blue, widened, not in shock, but in something that looked like a deep, painful remembrance. The air around them seemed to change, charged with a sudden heavy electricity. Clara froze, her hand tightening on the paper bag. She was used to people staring, but this was different. This was a man being physically struck by what he was seeing. Before she could move, before she could even process what was happening, his body reacted with a muscle memory that was absolute and unthinking. His shoulders snapped back, his heels clicked together on the linoleum floor of the diner entrance, and his right hand shot up in a crisp, perfect salute. His eyes, now glistening, were fixed on the tattoo on her arm as if it were a flag. The laughter from the table behind her died instantly. It didn't trail off or fade. It was severed, cut clean through by the sheer, unexpected gravity of the moment. The clinking of cutlery stopped. The cheerful chatter at nearby tables ceased. A heavy, profound silence descended upon the entire front section of the diner, a silence so complete that Clara could hear the hum of the refrigeration unit behind the counter. Every head had turned. Every pair of eyes was now fixed on the scene at the door. The quiet history teacher with the strange tattoo and the granite-solid man frozen in a gesture of ultimate respect. The man's voice, when he finally spoke, was thick with emotion, rough and gravelly as if pulled from a deep well. "Master Chief," he said, his voice carrying in the stunned silence. "I never got the chance to say it, so I'll say it now. Thank you for your service, and I am so sorry for your loss." Clara's carefully constructed mask of composure finally shattered. A choked sound escaped her lips, a half-sob, half-gasp. No one, in the 14 years since the tattoo had been inked, had ever understood. No one had ever seen it for what it truly was. They saw chaos and ugliness. This man, this stranger, saw a memorial. He saw the truth. The tattoo wasn't a symbol of rebellion. It was a meticulously detailed, permanent tribute to the 12 men she had failed to save. Clara wasn't, and never had been, in a prison or in a gang. She was a former combat medic, a Navy veteran who had served 2 tours in the chaos of the Iraq War. The twisted metal was the exact wreckage of a medevac helicopter, call sign Dust-Off 73, that had been shot down during a ferocious firefight in a volatile province. The weeping angel was a portrait of the young pilot, a woman with a fierce smile who loved classic rock and had a fiancé waiting at home. And the shattered letters, which most people mistook for a misspelled word or a gang tag, spelled out the call signs of the 12 soldiers she had worked desperately, futilely, to save as the helicopter burned around them. She was the sole survivor. Pulled from the wreckage with third-degree burns on her back and legs, she had spent months in recovery, the physical scars eventually healing to leave the deep, psychological ones that never would. The tattoo was her way of ensuring they were not forgotten. It was a portable headstone, a secret weight she carried everywhere. She had become a quiet history teacher, immersing herself in the distant past because the recent one was too painful to touch. She never spoke of her service. She never corrected the assumptions. And now, in a random diner, on a random Tuesday afternoon, a SEAL commander had recognized the specific, hellish imagery from a classified after-action report he must have read years ago. He saw the twisted metal of a specific bird, the angel with the shattered halo, and he knew. He knew what it meant. He knew the sacrifice it represented. The silence in the diner stretched on, thick and heavy. The young men who had been laughing were now frozen, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. The gum-snapping waitress stood still, a coffee pot forgotten in her hand. The world outside, the cars honking, the people walking by, seemed to exist in a different dimension, muffled and unreal. The SEAL commander slowly lowered his hand from the salute. He took a tentative step closer to Clara, his eyes never leaving hers. They were the eyes of a man who had seen his own share of horror, who understood the language of sacrifice that her skin spoke. "Chief Garcia," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Lieutenant Commander Miller. I was a junior lieutenant on the team that secured the LZ that night. I was one of the first boots on the ground after the crash." The name hit Clara like a physical blow. Garcia. Her name, a name she hadn't heard in a professional context in over a decade. She stared at him, her mind reeling, connecting dots she never knew existed. He had been there. He had walked through the same hellish landscape she had barely escaped. He had seen the wreckage, the aftermath, the loss. He hadn't just read a report, he had lived the periphery of her own personal nightmare. I remember your name from the report," she finally managed to whisper, her voice a ghost of its usual self. "You were the one who called in the extra corpsman." He nodded, a single, sharp movement. "We did what we could. It wasn't enough. It never is." His gaze fell to her tattoo again, this time with a profound reverence. I've never seen anything like that. It's them. It's all of them. The dam holding back 14 years of silence finally broke. It wasn't a flood of tears, but a quiet, profound sense of being seen. She looked down at her own arm, at the art that had been a source of so much shame and judgment, and for the first time, she saw it through his eyes. She saw the warrior's memorial it was always meant to be. The first person to break the spell was the old man at the counter. He was a weathered man in a faded trucker cap, a veteran of a different war, a different time. He didn't know what the tattoo meant, but he understood the language of the salute. He understood the look in Commander Miller's eyes. Slowly, deliberately, he pushed himself off his stool, stood up straight, and raised his own hand in a salute towards Clara. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. His action was a spark. A young woman in a business suit, her phone forgotten in her hand, looked from the old man to the commander to Clara, and though she had never served a day in her life, she understood the gravity of the moment. She placed her hand over her heart. A cook pushed open the swinging kitchen door, drawn by the silence, saw the scene, and instinctively wiped his hands on his apron and stood a little taller. One by one, person by person, the patrons of the diner rose to their feet. Some saluted, some placed hands on hearts, some simply bowed their heads in a shared, silent respect for a pain they could not comprehend, but could now, finally, acknowledge. The silence was no longer just the absence of sound. It was a presence, a living thing, filled with a collective, unspoken apology and a deep, newfound admiration. It was a stark contrast to the ugly laughter that had filled the space just moments before. Clara stood in the center of it all, still holding her bag of key lime pie, tears now streaming freely, unashamedly down her face. She wasn't crying from sadness, or not just from sadness. She was crying because for 14 years she had carried this weight entirely alone. She had been a ghost, living among people who saw only the surface. And now, in the space of a few minutes, a stranger had not only recognized the weight, but had asked to help her carry it. He had given her back her story. The young men who had mocked her were now pale and stricken. They sat frozen in their booth, unable to look away from the woman they had ridiculed. The leader of the group, the one who had made the train wreck comment, looked as if he might be sick. The full, horrifying weight of his mistake was crashing down on him. This wasn't some rebellious woman with bad taste. This was a hero. This was someone who had lived through something he couldn't even begin to imagine in his most frightening dreams. His laughter, so easy and cruel just minutes before, now echoed in his own mind like a coward's taunt. Commander Miller gently took Clara's elbow. "Chief," he said softly, "can I buy you a cup of coffee? I'd like to tell you about the men who pulled you out. And I'd like to hear about the ones we lost. It's important we remember." It was the perfect thing to say. He didn't want to talk about the horror. He wanted to talk about the heroes. He wanted to remember the people, not just the event. Clara could only nod, her voice completely gone. He guided her past the silent, standing patrons, past the table of humiliated young men who couldn't even meet her gaze, and led her to a quiet booth in the corner. The waitress, her eyes red-rimmed, appeared almost instantly, setting down 2 cups of coffee without a word, the pot shaking slightly in her hand. As Clara sat across from the commander, his weathered face a map of shared experience and unspoken understanding, she felt a tectonic shift inside her. For the first time in 14 years, the weight on her chest felt a little lighter. She wasn't just the quiet history teacher with the strange tattoo anymore. She was Clara. She was Chief Garcia. She was a survivor. And in the silent, respectful diner, surrounded by strangers who now understood, her story was finally beginning to be told. The chapter of silent shame was over. A new one, of acknowledged service and shared memory, had just begun. The ink on her arm would always be a reminder of loss, but now it would also be a symbol of the unbreakable bond between those who serve, and a testament to the power of a single moment of recognition to heal a wound that had festered for far too long. The coffee grew cold as they talked, their quiet voices a low murmur in the still hushed restaurant. He spoke of the chaos of that night, the acrid smell of burning fuel and desert dust, the frantic urgency of the rescue effort. He described the bravery of the men who had worked alongside Clara, their names and faces still vivid in his memory. He didn't shy away from the details, but he presented them with the clinical respect of a professional, framing the horror within the context of their duty and sacrifice. Clara, in turn, found herself talking. She spoke of the pilot, Lieutenant Sarah Jenkins, and her love for her fiancé, Mark. She described the young gunner, Petty Officer Second Class David Chen, who had just become a father, and had shown Clara a blurry photo of his newborn daughter just hours before the mission. She gave the statistics on her arm names and stories. She spoke of the heat of the fire, the desperate race against time, the terrible moment she realized she was the only one still moving. Words she had held inside for over a decade poured out of her in a quiet, steady stream. Commander Miller listened, not as a therapist, but as a fellow soldier bearing witness. He nodded, asked quiet questions, and remembered with her. Meanwhile, the world of the diner slowly resumed its motion, but it was forever changed. People ate their meals in subdued tones, their conversations punctuated by glances toward the corner booth. The cook sent out a fresh slice of key lime pie on the house, with a simple note on the plate, "With thanks." The young men who had laughed slipped out a side door as soon as they could, unable to face the quiet judgment in the room. They had been given a lesson they would not soon forget, a brutal education in the danger of making assumptions based on appearances. An hour later, Clara and Commander Miller finally stood up. He shook her hand, a firm, lingering grip that conveyed more than words ever could. "Chief," he said, "if you ever need to talk or if you just want to have coffee with someone who understands, you call me." He handed her a card with only his name and a phone number. "And I know a few others who were there that night. I think they'd be honored to meet you, to put a face to the name in the report." Clara looked at the card, then at him. For the first time in 14 years, the thought of connecting with her past didn't fill her with dread. It felt right. It felt like coming home. "Thank you, Commander," she said, her voice stronger now. "I'd like that." As she walked out of the diner, the paper bag with the free pie in her hand, the afternoon sun felt warm on her face. She glanced down at her forearm. The twisted metal was still there. The weeping angel still wept. The shattered letters were still broken. But for the first time, she saw them not as a brand of her failure, but as a badge of their honor. The laughter that had followed her for so long had finally been silenced, not by anger, but by the quiet, profound respect of a fellow warrior and the silent acknowledgement of strangers. The real-life story of her tattoo had finally been told, and in the telling, a long and lonely chapter of her life had come to a peaceful, healing end.